President Trump, the new Richard Nixon. I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, the New York Times has a piece from, I believe it was Peter Baker, a news analysis piece, which is kind of the thin line between news and editorial. And
I didn't know there was a line between news and editorial.
Well, there used to be. It was kind of a thing back in the day. But anyway, the piece is talking about how President Trump has essentially stepped over some lines that presidents have observed for the last 45 years in the wake of the Watergate investigation because nobody wants to look like Richard Nixon. In this case, the Times points out, he fired his attorney general, he fired his FBI director, and he dangled pardons in front of people who were potential witnesses in the case against him. All of this because Robert Mueller's report apparently does not call for obstruction of justice charges against the president. Bill, it took a long time for the Republican Party to get out of the shadow of Richard Nixon. How do you feel about being back in it?
Well, we're certainly not in the shadow of Richard Nixon. There is, it's funny that they would link Nixon and Trump because, as far as I can tell, there's really one fundamental difference between President Trump and President Nixon. And that fundamental difference, I think, is that President Nixon did it and Trump didn't.
Yes, and that is true as far as you take it. But the accusation, of course, that the Democrats are picking up is that the special counsel, Robert Mueller, went soft on the whole issue of obstruction of justice. And the attorney general, of course, is not going to press that because he's in President Trump's pocket. And so we should, as a country, be concerned that the president may have obstructed this investigation.
So are you telling me that these left-wing socialists are complaining because we didn't do it right? Is that what they're saying? That if we only had a chance to do it again, that this investigation would be done correctly, that we shouldn't just ignore the fact that, all of this money, time, and effort was found to prove nothing. This is a habit among left-wingers, I've noticed, to just constantly assume that if we do it again, especially in a close election, if we keep counting votes sooner or later, we'll get the result that we want, not the result that the American people were foolish enough to return.
I'm not sure that's their case, though, because I think they're making the same case. Richard Nixon may not have ordered the Watergate break-in. What he was nailed for was the cover-up. And so here they're saying, well, maybe Donald Trump didn't collude with the Russians to throw the 2016 election, but he seems to have made every effort to throw a wet blanket on the investigation of his own activities.
Well, first of all, scoreboard, okay? Are there any obstruction of justice charges? No,
not at the moment.
Well, you would think that after 2.5 years and all of the pressure and the hopes, in fact, as we talked about on a previous show, all of the dying hopes of people who were praying to live long enough to see the result of the Mueller report so that they could watch Trump get perp walked into jail. As far as the scoreboard is concerned, there is no obstruction of justice charges, and I don't imagine that Mueller has some and decided not to include them in his report.
Well, there were no charges from James Comey or the Attorney General at that time against Hillary Clinton either, Bill.
Well, that's because Hillary Clinton is in the pocket of the news media and the deep state government. James Comey was working for Hillary Clinton. Comey and Brennan were working against Donald Trump. The media is working for Hillary Clinton and against Donald Trump. And so is the entire Department of Justice. And the thing that's interesting about this, again, it's kind of the same difference between Nixon and Trump and Hillary and Trump. Hillary did it, Trump didn't. And so to say that there's somehow that even though no evidence was turned up by this report, nevertheless, there's some really bad things going on. It's childishness and it's progressivism, and I hope they keep it up.
Well, you know how it is with these cases, though. With these big kind of, very complicated cases at the federal level, often they don't get the guy for the underlying crime. They get him for lying to the investigators. So why should it be any different?
Is there any evidence in the Mueller report of Trump committing obstruction of justice offenses?
Well, we haven't seen the Mueller report yet.
Well, you would think that this would be something that might be mentioned when they released the summary of the Mueller report. Was it not stated that there were no obstruction of justice charges in that?
Well,
report?
I think what the summary said, and the summary came from a Trump appointee, Attorney General William Barr, who was a big fan of the president before he was appointed, and basically said that Mueller left that question open about whether obstruction charges should be brought.
Okay, so you're telling me that after the hopes and dreams of all of these progressives and half of the country and all the rest of these lunatics who hate Trump with a visceral passion, you're telling me that Mueller might have had grounds for obstruction of justice but decided not to go through with them because he's a gentleman? Is that the argument? Because I don't believe it. I don't believe it. I think that any effort at this point to accuse Trump of things that were not, that the Mueller report did not find evidence for, is to, number one, provide concrete evidence that this whole thing was a witch hunt, and more importantly, to completely, as usual, destroy the entire idea of innocent until proven guilty. That's how they lynched Brett Kavanaugh and a number of others. So I just sit there and say, hey, you know what? Again, it's like, this is like, the reason I keep saying scoreboard, Scott, is because it's like you've just whipped an arch rival on the field, and they're coming at you and they're saying, well, we scored more first downs than you did, and we even got more total yards than you did. And I forget which coach it was. It was either Bear Bryant or Joe Paterno, I think. Somebody came up to him after a football game and said, yeah, well, he'd just gotten whipped by the team. And they said, well, we scored more first downs than you did. And the coach said, well, okay, great. Next time we'll play for first downs. And that's the kind of thing that's going on here. I am delighted about it because the reason my confidence has been so much higher in the last 6-8 months or so is because I finally think that the progressives have gone so far down this road that they're actually starting to reveal what they actually think. They no longer have the discipline of Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama or Nancy Pelosi. They no longer have the discipline to stand in front of American flag factories and talk about how they spent 1,000 Sundays in church with Reverend Wright and never heard a single thing that would ever possibly upset him. And now you get people like AOC, who is just coming out and saying socialism's awesome, and Nancy Pelosi is being protested because she's not left-wing enough. And now you've got the Democrats who've been flogging this dead horse for 2.5 years now, and they're going to flog it for another 1.5 years, and then they'll probably flog it for the next 4 years after that as well, as if they keep this up.
Well, far from trying to explain it away, and by explain it away, I mean the charges that the Democrats and the New York Times, but I repeat myself, are making that Trump fired his attorney general, fired the FBI director, dangled pardons in front of people. He should have fired all of them.
Well,
this is my point. Far from being defensive about that, the White House legal team is actually saying this is part of an intentional strategy to recapture the appropriate constitutional executive authority, that the president certainly has the power to fire people that he has appointed, and he certainly has the power to pardon people. He's allowed to let the attorney general go. He's allowed to let the FBI director go. And so while the Democrats on one side, and I'm going to ask your opinion on this sort of politically, the Democrats on one side are basically saying, look, we've got a new kind of monarch here who has unchallenged power against legal authority. The Republicans in the Trump administration are saying, no, this is just the president's constitutional authority.
Read your Constitution. I know for most of these progressive leaders, the act of reading the Constitution would cause their skin to burst into flames. But nevertheless, it wouldn't be a bad idea. You are entirely correct. Every single thing that you've mentioned is well within the purview of the president's powers as described in the Constitution. And furthermore, I think we have gotten away from an excellent policy, which used to be the norm, and that was when a new president, certainly when Grant came in, for example, the president would come in and he'd fire everybody. He would bring in the people that he trusted and knew to run not just the cabinet, but other departments as well. If it turns out that the structure of our government, as based on the Constitution, says that the director of the FBI serves at the pleasure of the president, then if the president doesn't like the tie he's wearing, he has the power to fire that guy.
And there's no Democrat who's challenging what you just said. There's no Democrat who says
well,
that.
Then what are they? Then what's all the fuss about?
Here's what they're saying. It's not that the president came into office and cleaned house and put his own team in there. It's that after James Comey essentially pushed back on the president and did not go easy on Mike Flynn, for example, who was facing charges. After Jeff Sessions pushed back on the president because he recused himself from the investigation and turned that over to the special counsel. Essentially, the FBI director and the AG did things the president didn't like.
On the contrary, I'm just going to stop you right there.
Then the president relieved them from duty.
I'm going to stop you right there. It's not that they did things that the president didn't like. In the case of James Comey is a Democratic operative who is one of the most reprehensible figures in certainly in my lifetime, only because
fire him on day one.
Hold on. Well, the fact that he didn't fire him on day one goes to Trump's tolerance. It goes to Trump's fundamental fairness, I think. So you're saying he should have been fired on day one? I don't think there's a case. Look, he had the right to fire him on day one. I would have fired him on day one, but he didn't fire him on day one. He didn't fire James Comey until it was absolutely clear that Comey was leaking to the media stories that Donald Trump was unfit for whatever reason. This is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation leaking stories to the media for partisan politics, and that's certainly a fireable offense. In fact, my opinion, it's a jailable offense. As far as Sessions is concerned, Sessions recusing himself from this whole thing essentially neutered the office of the Attorney General for the first 2 years of Donald Trump's administration. I kept waiting daily for the Attorney General to come in with forkloads, cargo pallets worth of evidence against what Hillary Clinton, just as one example, did, against the corruption in the Justice Department under Loretta Lynch and Eric Holder, all the rest of it. And for 2 years, we sat there and watched Jeff Sessions do absolutely nothing. I would have fired Sessions much earlier. I would have, if I'd been entering my third month as president and I didn't have a comprehensive outline of how these charges were going to go, he would have been gone. And to suggest that Trump is guilty because he didn't fire Comey early enough, but he's also guilty because he fired Comey at all, and that he let his attorney general go, but he let him go after 2 years. I'm not really buying the contradictions here, Scott. I'm not buying them at all. This whole thing is a gigantic. When I say organized, I don't mean that there is a secret transmitter someplace that is sending out orders to James Comey and to Brennan and all the rest of these traitors. Because that's what they are. They swore an oath to protect the Constitution of the United States, and there's nothing in that oath that says, I will determine who the next president of the United States will be because I'm FBI director and I know what's better for the country than the Americans do. So what you've got is this ongoing, endless series of absolutely unspeakable moves on the part of government officials who act like royalty, who act like barons and nobles in service to their liege lord, and who have absolutely no accountability whatsoever. I think Donald Trump has made a tremendous mistake, and I think his mistake was not firing the entire frickin' staff of anybody who was under the pressure of the president. Anybody who served under the pleasure of the president, as outlined in the Constitution, I would have fired him the second I got to. In fact, I would have fired him before I put my bags down, and that is a function of what the last 2 years have shown us. When 2016 came along, as I've said many times before, I thought this whole idea of a deep state conspiracy was a bit much. I didn't think it was groundless, but I thought it was a bit much. Now I look at it and I think, my God, we completely underestimated the degree of corruption here. So I don't buy it. You're saying Trump's like Nixon because he fired his attorney general and he fired his FBI director? He fired the FBI director and the attorney general a year before the report was released. He could have fired him before the report even started, but he didn't. So, again, the report comes back. Trump didn't do anything. Nixon did. And somehow these are the same stories.
Well, again, what they're saying is Nixon didn't order the Watergate break-in. Nixon
ordered the cover-up.
Nixon ordered the cover-up. And so that's what they're saying is it's Trump didn't do the collusion, he did the obstruction.
Then where are the charges? If he didn't do the collusion, but he did the obstruction, where are the obstruction of justice reports? Where's the evidence? Where has this 2.5 year, $25 million, 500 witness investigation taken us if after that time, that money, and that many witnesses, there is not enough evidence to bring charges of obstruction of justice against the president? What does that tell you? What does it tell you, Scott? When people say, well, even though that there were no obstruction of justice charges filed, there's a lot of stuff in there that we're pretty sure. But no, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. In this country, there's a presumption of innocence. If you have sufficient evidence to go to trial and bring charges, you go to trial and bring charges. And if you don't, then you have either misidentified the culprit or you have failed miserably in your job as prosecutor, because the burden of proof is on the prosecution, not on the defense.
So final question, and we're going to have to keep this tight. We're running a little bit long here. The New York Times is making sort of two major points. One, they're not saying that it's, or Peter Baker anyway, is not saying that the president exercised unconstitutional authority. It said at the heart of the obstruction question is the question of whether constitutional authority can become an abuse of power, depending on how
God's
it's used.
sake. Oh, for God's sake, please.
Let me finish it up here. And the risk, and this is the risk to your side, my friend, the risk is that some future president that you don't like will decide to exercise the same kind of authority by dumping his AG or firing his FBI director or dangling pardons in front of potential witnesses against him. And it could be, President Joe Biden, President Beto O'Rourke, President Kamala Harris who's doing this.
Well, first of all, the president exceeding constitutional powers in the future, nothing that you've said will undo the fact that under Barack Obama, we had 8 years of governance by executive order, which were designed to see if you could increase the number of interns at the White House, not determine the nation's health care and immigration policies. So in terms of constitutional abuse of power, what they're talking about is they're saying the Constitution may have allowed the president too much power, when in point of fact, under Barack Obama, they simply just wrote their own dictates. They simply dictated that we're going to delay the implementation of Obamacare for another 6 months. You need new legislation to do that. You couldn't get it, so we just sign it off by executive order. So first of all, in terms of the abuse of power in regard to the future, I'm not particularly worried about seeing anything worse than I've already seen. But the real issue here, and now they've actually really announced their true colors. This is really, really where the problem is. What the New York Times is saying is that the president may have too many powers, that he may have too many powers. Forget all the idea of the power of just being able to write a law into existence with executive order. Put that 8 years aside of Barack Obama. The Constitution grants the president the powers he has because that is an appropriate measure of powers for the chief executive. And the New York Times is essentially saying that the Constitution got it wrong, which is their that should be the masthead for the New York Times. The New York Times, take away all the news that's fit to print. The New York Times, below that, the Constitution got it wrong. That's what they ought to be.
They're not saying the Constitution got it wrong. They're saying that the constitutional authority granted to the executive can be interpreted in such a way as to become an abuse of power.
Is there any indication that the president illegally exceeded his powers after this 2.5-year investigation? Yes or no?
We'll see when we read the Mueller report.
I see. Okay, so you're telling me now that Nancy Pelosi saying he's not worth impeaching, and Brennan saying, maybe I was acting on some bad information. All of this stuff is premature because nobody knows what's in this report that's been read by the Attorney General, and the Attorney General has simply decided, I'm just going to squash the whole thing. I don't think so. You know the truth, I know the truth, they know the truth, and Trump knows the truth. Everybody knows the truth. There was not evidence of collusion, and there's not evidence of a cover-up, not enough evidence to bring charges. That's the result of this goat rodeo. And by the way, what's really happening, if you really want to understand what's actually happening now with the New York Times, here's what's actually happening. They knew at the beginning that there were no grounds for these charges. The way the charges were filed were ridiculous. The FBI says, well, we need an investigation. Well, what basis do you base that on? Well, there's been leaks in the media about Trump colluding with the Russians. Well, where did those leaks come from? Well, we planted them. So the entire Mueller thing is designed to discredit Trump, discredit his presidency, discredit the election, basically say Hillary really did win the election, and mostly discredit the American people for having the audacity to stand up to these liberal elite bastards. So what's happening now is, now that the phase of indicting Donald Trump has ended, we will now continue to phase 2, which is indicting Donald Trump through hearsay, speculation, and whatever the case may be. This thing has blown up in their faces. It's a catastrophe for them. And they're going to keep flogging this dead horse until they arrive at the gates of hell where they belong.
Well, there is narrative and there is counter-narrative. And here on Bill Whittle Now, 5 days a week, you get both of them. We don't cheat you out of either side of the argument, and we try to give them both to you vigorously and fully. We appreciate the members at BillWhittle.com who have clicked that Become a Member link and joined this enterprise and made it possible for us to do this. They've also become content producers themselves at the new BillWhittle.com website with their own blog and their comments and private messaging systems.
They've been great.
They're having a ball there, and we appreciate them. If you'd like to join their ranks, just go to BillWhittle.com, click the Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.